Have you ever experienced having a stomach ache because in your rush, you had no time to chew your food properly, so you just gobbled it up? Or have you ever spent a whole sleepless night because you finished up 3 large blobs of porterhouse steak? Well, they call that indigestion. In today's language, perhaps we can describe it as a digestive system overload. It means your system can only take so much. If you don't want it to happen ever again, the solution is obvious. Chew your food properly. Relish it. Don't rush your meal. And please, stop when you are full. We often see scenes like these on television. A mother prepares a good breakfast. Husband and kids oversleep. And then the school bus is already there in front of the house when they start to take a bite. And husband still has his mouth full and he's buttoning his shirt. He sips his coffee very quickly to be able to swallow his food. And he darts away. Well, was this not actually the typical urban family scene before the pandemic happened? People rushing. People having no time to process things. No time to let them sink in. In this regard, I think we must say that the pandemic has brought some blessings too. Among other things, it has taught us to slow down. It seems to have given us more time, more opportunities to listen to each other, to think, to reflect, to open our minds and hearts, to understand what's happening around us, to pray so that we will find out what God is trying to tell us. Well, my friends, if there is physical indigestion, perhaps there is also such a thing as a spiritual indigestion. Jesus speaks about it in today's gospel. Listen to what Jesus says. I have much more to tell you, but you cannot take it all now. No problem. He's not in a rush. And later he adds, when the Spirit of truth comes, He will guide you to all truth. Meaning, He will lead you, but gradually, at your own pace. As they say in Cebuano, hinay-hinay, basta kanunay. Slowly, but constantly. You know, this reminds me of a vision of St. Augustine, or supposedly by St. Augustine, while he was reflecting one day on the mystery of the Holy Trinity. Legend has it that he was walking by the sea, and he saw a child playing by the seashore, holding a bucket and a shovel. And Augustine asked the boy, "Hey boy, what are you doing?" And the boy replied, "Oh, I am going to transfer all the water of the sea into my hole." And Augustine, of course, replied, or laughed, and replied with a tone of ridicule. He said, "But that's very silly. How do you expect to fit all the water of the sea into that little hole?" Well, supposedly the child looked up at him and said, "And what makes you think that you can fit the whole mystery of the eternal God into your little head?" Nice little legend. In 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 12, St. Paul addresses the Corinthian people as infants in Christ, meaning they still needed to be fed with spiritual milk. That's how he calls it, rather than solid food. some people are not yet disposed for the more serious things because they're not yet ready for it. It could only mean that St. Paul was conscious of the art of gradual, I call it gradual spiritual feeding in his preaching. He does his preaching by stages, piecemeal, one little bite at a time. And so St. Luke tells us how Paul would do something like this with the Greeks when he finally arrived in Athens. Take note, he just came from Macedonia, went down to Athens. And when he arrived in the city of the great philosophers like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, the city where people were used to discussing lofty ideas, on one particular day, St. Paul stood in that place called Areopagus, where the court trials or the Senate hearings were being held. And he began a little discourse. First, he called attention to, what he called the religiosity of the Athenians. He said, you are very religious people. And I think he really wanted to say, mga sigurista kayo, ano? Because they had a row of niches for the Greek gods and goddesses that were standing on pillars and properly identified. But he noted that there was one niche that was empty, which had a pedestal, and the name that was written there was to the unknown God. Di ba yan sigurista? It's like, we have all the gods, we want to make sure we please them all, but just in case there is someone we do not know, okay, we have a space for him too. And St. Paul now begins to say, this God, whom you do not know, is the one I wish to make known to you. He does not dwell in temples, nor in images made by human hands. And he repeats that expression, by the way, 3 times. Made by human hands. God could not possibly have been made by us, because it's the other way around. We were the ones who were made by Him. How arrogant of us. In effect, St. Paul is telling them that the unknown God remains unknown to them for as long as they are trying desperately to make Him in their image and likeness or to fit Him in their human categories. You see, God is not what you make of Him or what you conceive Him to be. He will always be more than what you say of Him or what you portray Him to be. In fact, St. Paul points out that this kind of attitude is very disrespectful of God, especially when we think we can manipulate God, as if He is the one who needs us, not the other way around. This reminds me also of that amusing story in the book of Daniel, chapter 13. Well, actually, Daniel has only 12 chapters. I mean, the proto-canonical Daniel. But we Catholics read the deuterocanonicals as well, and we have the additions to Daniel. And one of those additions is that chapter where the prophet angers the Babylonian king because he referred to their God as a God made by human hands. And there Daniel characterizes the temple priests as deceivers who manipulate the people by portraying their God as a God who had to be constantly fed, kaya laging maraming alay, because daw their God had to be fed because He got angry when He got hungry. And so Daniel succeeds in exposing this religion as a sham and a pure racket. Mag-iingat sa relihiyon na racket. His faith is firm. The true God, he says, does not need to be fed. Kaya hindi natin dapat pinagmamalaki ang mga alay natin sa Kanya. The Eucharistic prayer says, you have no need of our praise, yet even our desire to thank you is itself your gift. And so, God does not need to be fed. God does not need our offerings. He does not need to be fattened by our sacrifices. The only sacrifice He requires of us is a contrite spirit, a heart humble and contrite. You don't feed God because it is God who feeds us. He is like a shepherd to His flock. Back to St. Paul. St. Paul explains that making God in our image and likeness is arrogance. And it also reflects ignorance. We forget that it's the other way around. We are God's image and likeness. We are God's representation. And then he proceeds to mention that the one who truly showed the face of the unknown God is Jesus Christ. Ayan, bumubuelo na siya. He's talking about the resurrection. Suddenly, when the Athenians heard about resurrection, nawalan sila ng gana. Well, they were not yet disposed for this doctrine. And so, some of them react negatively. They say, oh, we'll just listen to you another day on this. We're sick of it already, he says. And they walk out. And it is then that Paul realizes, maybe nasobrahan na sila. System overload. Spiritual indigestion. What does he do? Hindi niya ipipilit. He stops already. He stops already. And instead, he focuses on a small group, Dionysius, Damaris, and a few others who joined him. And these ones were more ready for the solid spiritual food. We prepare ourselves now for that solid spiritual food.